I stumbled onto this thing called the New Age movement in 1981. I did not have a name for it initially. I knew something was going on. My husband had a 1979 accident, near fatal accident, where he lost both legs above the knee. And in that period of time, of course, I was looking for spiritual comfort and sustenance. And the nearest thing to me was a bookstore across the street from one of my downtown Detroit offices in the Penobscot building called Cokesbury Books. And I would peruse those shelves looking for things that would help me make it day to day in a very difficult time of my life. I found books that did, some very solid books that got me from one day to the next. And then I found a line of books that had a very different of theology. And they were saying things like we could worship God and call him Buddha. We could worship God and call him Krishna. God's ways were not our ways, and his thoughts were so much higher than our thoughts. Perhaps these were just different manifestations of God to different cultures. And I remembered passages about religious apostasy. And I started analyzing some of these books, and they carried a political agenda as well as a religious deviation. And one day I just bought a pile of those books and took them home and analyzed them for common elements. And I still remember the books I initially bought at that Cokesbury Detroit bookstore. When Religions Change, Hope for the Future, I believe by Charles S. McCoy, who was a professor of the Graduate School of Theology in Berkeley, Graduate Union School of Theology in Berkeley, California. There was Toward a Human World Order by Gerald and Patricia Meshi, who purported to be Catholic. There was a book called Rich Christians in an Age of Hunger by Ron Sider, who was supposed to be an evangelical Christian, Baptist, teaching at a Baptist seminary. And there were a couple of others. And I took them and I analyzed the common elements, and I was somewhat puzzled. Where were they getting this stuff? And I didn't start putting it together until I found a book by a Los Angeles author called The Aquarian Conspiracy. The author was Marilyn Ferguson. She died last October of a heart attack, and she's no longer with us. Marilyn Ferguson saw as signs of hope, signs that I saw as something less. She wrote enthusiastically in a chapter on religious developments that now the heretics are gaining ground, doctrine is losing its authority, and knowing is superseding belief. And she was talking about some spiritual developments that would enhance people's frame of mind to accept their political developments. She quoted from a book called The Aquarian Gospel of Jesus the Christ, which I tracked down the next day at the same Methodist bookstore. And analyzing that book, I found some real surprises. I discovered that Jesus had studied at the feet of pagan masters, and so did his cousin John the Baptist. And the book was written in very clever English, biblical style English, very similar to the English that appears in both the King James Bible and the Douay-Rheims Bible. If you didn't know the real thing, it could have been a convincer. And the Aquarian masters sitting in council in the preface to this book had given the answer to some universal questions. Was Jesus always the Christ? Well, their answer was no. Jesus was not always the Christ. Edward wasn't always the king. Lincoln wasn't always the president. Jesus was not always the Christ. He had earned the degree Christ by a life of strenuous service and equipping himself to receive the Christ consciousness. Well, just who were these Aquarian masters sitting in conference? And I remembered some scriptural passages that in the last days some shall depart from the faith and give heed to seducing spirits and doctrines of devils. And I started suspecting that maybe this age of Aquarius was not about a time of peace, light, and love. It might be of a time that was somewhat less pleasant for those of us who did adhere to the faith. I got over to chapter 14 of that Aquarian gospel, and John the Baptist was having a conversation with his pagan mentor, and he said, these books are so wonderful, these precepts are so sublime, the Bhagavad, the Upanishads. Why do we have need of any further revelation? So his pagan master explained to him, he said that whenever mankind entered certain phases of his development, he would need some help to take him across those rocky shoals. And that the Hebrew Bible with its Psalms and Proverbs in its proper place had been given for that purpose. Said, but now the day star from on high begins to shine, and Jesus is the flesh-made messenger to bring this light to man. Didn't stop there. Then went on and said, but in the ages yet to come, man will attain to greater heights, and greater lights will be needed and sent. And I wrote in my margin a neat trick. It said, and finally at last, a mighty master soul will come to earth to light the way to the throne of perfect man. I have to add that the Ullman series was running on television just about that time. And you felt like ducking into the nearest church daily for spiritual protection from what they were talking about. Marilyn Ferguson described a political social movement that was big, and she at one point referred to it as the movement that has no name. She said that people that were into this thing communicated with each other with code words and signals, and that if they ran into any hint of opposition, they would quickly clam up because their ideas had been too easily misunderstood in the past with things like the Crusades against the Albigensians, the putting down of witchcraft in Europe, so on and so forth. Well, I had to learn more about it, and I had studied in analyzing these books a common vocabulary, which I assumed were buzzwords. I assumed correctly. Things were done holistically. We didn't live on Earth. We lived on this very crowded planet called Spaceship Earth, and a tiny little global village. We all had to undergo this mysterious transformation, which was basically going into an altered state and getting possessed. I don't know how more bluntly to put it. Because the planet was just too small, too crowded for our formerly divisive religious beliefs. I had to get to the bottom of this. I didn't quite know where to take it. If the movement was 1/10 as big as she claimed it was, we had some serious issues. I decided on a course of action. I would carry Marilyn Ferguson's book and the Aquarian Gospel of Jesus the Christ along with me, and I would see who picked up on it. Took me 2 days to catch my first one. I was in Judge Stacy's courtroom in Wayne County Circuit Court, motion call, and a lawyer came across the room. In fact, it was opposing counsel, and he was just beaming, and he said, "I see you have the Aquarian Gospel." He was so happy. Well, I made a bad mistake. I told him what I thought of the Aquarian Gospel, what I thought of the Aquarian conspiracy, and what I thought of the collective intelligence of everybody buying into it. His face fell, and he said, "Well, that's my wife's thing. I don't know very much about it." I decided I'd better switch tactics and be cool, as they say. So I continued to carry the books with me. The next person I ran into was not into it. He was into the political scene. He was running for Detroit Common Council, and he told me. And frankly, after I found this stuff, I could care less about anybody's political campaign. It made everything I was doing with the National Association of Women Lawyers look inconsequential. It made everything that was going on in the political world look inconsequential. Back in those days, I knew just about every important politician in the state of Michigan on a first-name basis. And suddenly, what we were doing there looked trivial to me. And anyway, this person approached me on the street, said, "Hi, Connie," and then said he was thinking of running for Detroit Common Council. And of course, I gave him some encouragement, polite encouragement, and said, "Let me know if there's anything I can do." And it was probably insincere because I did not have anybody's political campaign on my mind. I was being polite. A couple weeks later, I get a telephone call, and he was going to run, and he was going to have a coming out party, and he would and his wife would love for me to join them the evening before he filed. And I said, "Fine, I'll try to make it." I was on my way to a church service. I wanted to curl up under that altar again so I could escape these evil currents that were obviously taking place. And on my way down the freeway, I had this thought, maybe you should go to that party. Somebody's likely to be there who knows about it. If they're not at that party, it's not big enough to worry about. Because he was a great guy, but boy did he attract the eccentrics. And so I went to the party and I walked in, and he introduced his campaign manager, who was a woman he personally had introduced me to 14 years earlier. And it was a woman I had had a strange conversation with when my husband was being released from the hospital. And she said, she told the crowd addressing them, she said, "When you see Al, you are to visualize him in the councilman's chair. In your mind, he is already to be councilman." She said, "And through your act of visualization, you will gain the cooperation of the higher powers of the universe, who will work to bring your vision into manifestation." And my mind is clicking, visualization, guided imagery, and then my mind went back to the last conversation I had had with her when I had seen her in April 1980, as my husband was coming out of the hospital after a 6-month stay. And I remember we were in the Penobscot building with my then young assistant lawyer, and she came over to our table, and I invited her to join us. And then she said, "How are you doing, Connie?" And I said what I said to everybody in those days, "Terrible." she said, well, what's wrong? And I told her about my husband's very tragic accident. And she said, why, Connie, she said, that's no problem at all. I can come over to the house and heal him for you. I said, you can? She said, yes, I've been studying healing. I said, well, I guess if you have been studying healing, you think you can heal him, but tell me, Phyllis, how do you plan to accomplish that? She said, with cosmic energies I receive from the universe. And I'm putting two and two together, and I'm thinking cosmic energies, mind sciences, visualization. Those were things that Marilyn Ferguson discussed in her book, The Aquarian Conspiracy. I wonder if Phyllis is part of them. And so I had this idea that I should engage her in conversation about it, and I approached her when the party broke up, and I said, Phyllis, I heard you mention the mind sciences. She said, yes. I said, you know, years ago I read a book by a plastic surgeon named Matthew Maltz called Psycho-Cybernetics. And I've been so interested in the mind sciences since then. Why don't you let me take you to dinner, and maybe you can tell me more about it? She said, sure. You have to watch us lawyers. We're tricky. We can get a lot of information for the price of a meal. We headed to a delicatessen, and she was very careful to order the red zinger teas. She'd lost 20 pounds. She looked gorgeous. I'd found them. And I said, Phyllis, I said, tell me about the New Age, or tell me about the mind sciences. I'm fascinated. And she said, it's called the New Age movement. I don't know if you've heard of it or not. That was the first time I had heard those three words, New Age movement, together. And I said, no, is it possibly called anything else? And she said, yes, it's sometimes called the Aquarian Network, the Age of Aquarius. And at that point I held up the Aquarian Gospel. I said, is this part of it? And she just beamed. She said, why, yes, it certainly is. And I said, well, what do you do in this movement? She said, we communicate with code words and signals. Well, I wasn't ready for that much that fast, but I said, Phyllis, I've been studying on my own the very best I could without a good teacher like you to help me. Now, so help me, I did not know, I swear I did not know that they had a slogan in their movement saying when the pupil is ready, the master will appear. I did not know that. I said, I think I may know some of the words. Can you help me? She said, sure. I said, holistic. She almost fell off her chair. Spaceship Earth, global village, paradigm, new paradigm shifts. And I have to confess, up until the time I discovered the New Age movement, I thought paradigm was 20 cents. Well, anyway, we finished our vocabulary lesson, and I said, well, communicating's fine and fun, but what are we communicating about? She said, we believe the mind operates on principles, just as one's body operates on principles. And if you want your mind to work effectively for you, you must know the principles. I said, well, that sounds logical enough. Tell me, what are the principles? And she told me a few that went in this ear and out that ear. It sounded like sheer gobbledygook to me. I'm sure now I would recall it and digest it. And then she said the most important principle of all is karma. I said, karma? Karma, I said, Phyllis, could this have anything to do with Eastern religions? She said, well, yes, Eastern religions are part of it. She said, but we're much larger than the Eastern religions. And I was doing an inward gulp. That was a pretty big portion of the world to say, that's nothing. We're lots bigger than them. And I said, well, I might as well tell you I've read The Aquarian Conspiracy. Now, when I said that, she frowned very deeply. I really think that the little spirits that they try to get in touch with were communicating with her, attempting to communicate with her very deeply. And she frowned and she said, Marilyn Ferguson is a friend of mine. We've appeared on lecture platforms together. We've given workshops together. But her book didn't really tell it the way it is. And I suspected she was trying to detect whether I was pro or con before she went any further. And fortunately, forewarned is forearmed. Marilyn Ferguson had said they do that. So I said, well, Phyllis, I read that book. I said, it looked like a really good book to me. What's wrong with it? And as soon as I said that, she was all smiles. And she said the movement is much, much larger than Marilyn Ferguson described it. Well, Marilyn Ferguson had described a sweeping worldwide movement that was especially powerful even in the United States government and in the European Union. And to say that the movement was much larger than Marilyn Ferguson had said it was significant indeed. So at that point, I said, Phyllis, I said, you're going to think I'm crazy or something. I said, but since Barry's accident, I've become quite the Bible scholar. I said, I am convinced that this very well may be the movement that was prophesied that would bring the Antichrist on the scene and install him in power. I thought she would say, you're crazy. She didn't. She still thought I wanted to run off and be a soldier in the Aquarian army. She said, oh yes, she said, that's very perceptive of you. She said, I have been convinced of that for many years myself. Well, I had a stack of books with me. Anybody that knows me knows I usually have a stack of books with me. These days, anybody that knows me knows I usually have a computer with me. And I picked up one of the books in the stack, The Aquarian Gospel, and I turned to page 14. They've repaginated cleverly since I gave those initial talks, and pointed to a line that said, one may enter fully into the spirit of the God of force. And then I turned to a line in sacred scripture saying, he shall honor in his estate the God of force is a God whom his fathers knew not. It reads that way in both the Douay Rheims and the King James versions of the Bible. And she said, you saw it. You saw it. She said, that's such an important point, and most esotericists fail to grasp it immediately. I could have taken over the Theosophical Society. She said, also you must remember that in the New Age movement and at Unity, we believe that Jesus and the Christ are two separate entities. The Christ is an office, not a man. Well, I just instinctively quoted a passage from Scripture to her, who is a liar, but he that denies Jesus is the Christ. He is Antichrist that denieth the Father and the Son. Well, suddenly she had two New Age mystic crystal revelations. A, Constance Cumby did not wish to run off and join the age of Aquarius. And B, she, Phyllis, had told Constance far too much. So she started backtracking. And she said, you know, Connie, she said, it's very difficult for me to talk with you. I have received a vision of light. She said, you should pray for wisdom that God would show you the hidden meaning of these scripture passages. Now, there is strong admonitions in Scripture when Satan appears to you, he will appear as an angel of light. And these folks all think they're seeing lots and lots of light. And Phyllis, I said, have you read the Scriptures for yourself? She said, no, I very carefully avoided doing that because it might tend to confuse me. I said, well, let me tell you something. I said, I didn't find all that contradictory stuff in there. I said, matter of fact, the further I read, the more I nodded in agreement. I said, I said, there were a couple things. I might like to talk to St. Paul about one of these days. But I said, they're not important. And she started laughing, and she said, my father was a minister. I know what you mean. And our food arrived. And I'll tell you, I can keep my priorities straight. I was not going to let the devil, the Antichrist, all the forces of hell interfere with a good meal. I was happily biting into my food, and I looked across the table, and Phyllis was not happy. And she was angrily gritting her teeth. And she was saying, it's not right. It simply is not right. That book is too misleading. It shouldn't be allowed. I said, what's that, Phyllis? And she almost spit it out. It was like a scene almost out of one of the movies about The Exorcist. She said, the Bible! I said, why on earth would you say something like that? And again, she almost spit it out. She said, the Antichrist is not the negative thing the Bible's made him out to be. I said, well, Phyllis, I said, I like you very much. Please don't get caught on the wrong side of this issue. And she gave me a common New Age line. She said, there are no sides. Well, armed with New Age movement, I knew better what to investigate. And my son handed me a paper one day talking about a bookstore, a local bookstore called Mayflower Books. And he said, Mom, this looks like what you were talking about. They said they were a metaphysical clubhouse of sorts. I said, sure does. After I closed my office that particular Friday afternoon, I headed over to that bookstore. I walked in, and the store manager said, we're closing. I said, well, I just need a few things. I'll pay cash for them. I said, I drove a long way to get here. My office was downtown at that point, and we lived in the Jeffersonian, way on the east side. I said, do you have anything on the New Age movement? And he looked at me like I was crazy, and he said, lady, the whole darn store. I said, do you have anything on Findhorn? I had found a book at a Sears Health Food rack about the Findhorn Foundation in Scotland, which is a very important New Age center. And he said, our Findhorn, and he corrected my pronunciation, section is right there. Our David Spangler section is right there also. So anyway, I bought several books and left and analyzed the books. It's the first time I'd heard of David Spangler. I back up. He was mentioned in the book on Findhorn. And David Spangler's book, which you could carry into Sunday school and not attract a lot of attention, Reflections on the Christ, had a chapter entitled Lucifer, Christ, and God. And he said that Lucifer was a great being, and that in order to enter the New Age, we would have to take a Luciferian initiation. That was the required entry point. His book, Revelation, The Birth of a New Age, said that those who didn't accept this would be released from physical embodiment and sent to another dimension other than physical incarnation where they would be happier. I picked up a book, another book I had picked up that same day was New Age Politics by Mark Satin. He had a list of 25, which was expanded to 100 New Age groups in a subsequent edition. And Mark Satin had groups ranging from Amnesty International through Zero Population Growth. And one of the 25 and then the 100 organizations he listed was World Goodwill in New York City, a division of Lucis Trust. I own 3 books in my personal library from when they were officially known as Lucifer Publishing Company, something they tried to deny for several years, and something now that is open on their website. And he said that of Lucis World Goodwill, it said they were working for the reappearance of the Christ. Now, what is the New Age movement all about? There's been a lot of information out there. There's been a lot of disinformation out there. But when you boil it down to its essence, it is about 3 things. And despite all the admonitions telling you go back to sleep, it is about a new world order. The terminology pretty much started with them. It is about a new world religion that basically synthesizes and syncretizes everything into one pot. And then after all this is done, Jesus is conveniently ushered out the door. And the third thing that it is about, that they are openly talking about, is a New Age Messiah. The reappearance of the Christ, they put it. A Christ they cheerfully admit is not Jesus. When I discovered the movement, it had taken strong root many places. And there were many things I didn't understand about it that I now understand. And I have to tell you, I had opposition from where I least expected it. I had support sometimes from where I least expected it. And I'm happy to tell you that many New Agers repented, came out of the movement as though they had seen the devil, never looked back. One of the most important New Age publishers, the publisher of Donald Key's Earth at Omega, Passage to Planetization, wrote me a lovely letter, which I received at home, I believe, in early 1985. And he told me some of the things that he had been in and involved with, that he had, a friend had given him my book, and he had gone back to Donald Key's. He had published Donald Key's and Norman Cousins' very New Age book, Earth at Omega, Passage to Planetization. One of the acknowledgments in that book to my mentors in the order of their appearance was Jewel Cole. This was the spirit that Alice Bailey claimed had spoken through her for the Lucifer publishing materials, that was her channeled source. And he had been an administrator of Lucis Trust in New York, as well as a president of World Federalists, and also SANE, the anti-nuclear group. The last I heard of him, he was involved with the Sri Chinmoy cult in New York City, and that's a cult that had tremendous, tremendous influence at the United Nations, still does. I just interviewed somebody from that who formerly had been associated with that cult, had been raised in that cult by parents who were in that cult, and fortunately broke away as an adult and wrote an outstanding book called Cartwheels and a Sari by Jayat Tam, T-A-M-M. Donald Keyes had formed an organization that had a virtual world's who's who. It was called Planetary Citizens. And he had many famous people around the world as part of it. And they were holding large conferences. And one of the names that is known in Catholic circles that was active with him, very active until the end as far as I know, was Father Hesburgh from Notre Dame University, Theodore Hesburgh. Another name that popped up and was having influence, disparate influence in Catholic circles, was Matthew Fox. Now, when we discovered this stuff, Matthew Fox was riding high. The New Agers were bragging that they had compromised most religious structures to a point where they were ready to be used. In 1982, Matthew Fox was brought in by the Archdiocese of Detroit Education Department to influence all the educators here. In 1983, by the Liturgies Committee of the Archdiocese of Detroit. And I did not have the opportunity to hear him in 1982. I did hear him in 1983. And in about a week after I heard him speak in Detroit, I was in Fort Wayne, Indiana. And the New Age bookstore that inspired the title of my book, The Hidden Dangers of the Rainbow, the bookstore I visited at Thanksgiving time, 1983, was the same bookstore I had visited in 1981, but they were now at a new location. People had gotten wise to part of their agenda, and cash flow wasn't quite as good as it had been. And there was a paper in there called Circle Network News. There was a large headline said, "Starhawk teaches at Holy Names." And it said Starhawk, who was a self-active, politically active witch, self-confessed witch, said teaching nuns, priests, ministers, and Christian educators was a new but deeply rewarding experience. We danced the spiral. They jumped something else, jumped the kettle, danced the spiral, and found other new and innovative ways to express ourselves. Isn't it wonderful to find such a sympathetic spirit of paganism within the Christian world? I mailed that newspaper to Bishop Gumbleton, who told me he had had complete confidence in Matthew Fox and the Archdiocese of Detroit Liturgy Committee, and said this might illustrate the concerns we discussed when I was there that day. And I took that with me to Seattle. And I gave it to Catholics United for the Faith in Seattle. And they, Frank Riley, I believe his name is, he was the father of the woman who headed the successful anti-euthanasia committee in Seattle, in the state of Washington. He decided he was going to mail this to Cardinal Ratzinger in the Vatican. And Cardinal Ratzinger opened the file on Matthew Fox. And it took several years for the investigation, but in 1988, Matthew Fox was ordered silenced for a year. In 1993, he was eventually excommunicated, and now he's an Episcopalian priest, still holding forth in these circles. But in the Archdiocese of Detroit itself, there were tremendous, tremendous divisions going on. The New Age movement had infected just about everything you can think of. One of the very good Orthodox priests in the city of Detroit was called on the carpet for committing 3 theological sins. He used the term in his catechesis Jesus and Christ interchangeably, ignoring the rich, subtle variation in meanings. B, he erroneously said Jesus was born in Bethlehem, ignoring the rich, subtle, ignoring the fact that modern Bible scholars no longer believe that to be the case. And C, he either was not familiar with modern theologians such as Matthew Fox, or else he had consciously rejected them. He laughed. He said they got it right the 3rd time. He'd consciously rejected them. And he was called in with the object they were then trying to screen out people who were anti-New Age. He took me down with him to the Archdiocese offices as his attorney. We got down there, the panel of inquisitors one of whom I understand is now sitting in prison for sexual crimes. They grinned as though they had swallowed the canary. Said, "The bishop wants us to meet with you." And they said, "Who is this?" And he said, "This is my attorney." They said, "You're not allowed to have an attorney here." Well, I went out and sat down, had their closed door meeting with the brass. The Archdiocese secretarial pool was sitting in, they had chairs, they would sit outside in the cubicles, outside their bosses' offices. The bosses were in with trying to get rid of this troublemaking priest who used the term Jesus and Christ interchangeably. And one of the ladies, who appeared to be pretty much a leader of the group, spoke up and she said, "Why, that's terrible." She said, "That nice young priest is in there and can't have his attorney with him." Well, I had the entire secretarial pool of the Archdiocese of Detroit all to myself. And I took the opportunity to educate them on the New Age movement. They gasped. They said, "We wondered what was going on around here. Suddenly every crucifix in the place came down. Huge rainbows went up in their place. The bookstore was almost as well stocked as the Mayflower." And I'm happy to tell you the last time I was there, I haven't been there in a while, but the last time I was down there, it was scrubbed so clean it was almost boring. There were a couple books I would have liked to have moved off the shelf, but for the most part it was cleaner than most Christian bookstores I had been in. I complimented them on it, and they said a manager named Ray had come in and really scrubbed the place out. I said, "Well, thank God for Ray." Anyway, we've been through a long, nasty battle. The fight is not over. They've been regrouping. In 1993, Pope John Paul II issued a strong statement against the New Age movement. And the current Pope has issued strong statements about the New Age movement. The New Agers are bragging they still have their insiders at the Vatican. And what is going down now is something called the Alliance of Civilizations. And this is very serious machinery that is being put in place by the same New Age factions. And it is organized under the auspices of the United Nations. They had the president of Spain and Turkey, Erdogan and Zapatero, officially, quote, recommend the deal, but there were some earlier sources. And they've organized it at the United Nations under a Secretary General who is a former Prime Minister of Portugal. And they have drawn up guidelines which they hope to have in full implementation by 2010. Now, they've been slowed down than before, and nothing can happen till God's ready. But they believe that they're in a position this time. Crisis equals opportunity, and their pillars this time are global governance, a new world religion, and like Donald Keyes, the founder of Planetary Citizens, said, don't think for 1 minute you can have a world government or global governance without having a head of that global governance. And they're still pointed to some very serious things. And there is an apostate former nun named Karen Armstrong who purports to be a scholar on religions. She hates God. She hates Christianity. And she's been very vocal about it. And this religious exclusivism, these Christians saying Jesus is the only way, just has to stop. And what they have set up is a group of friends. When they say group of friends, it doesn't mean a committee of people that are for it. The group of friends means countries who have subscribed and are on board by treaty. The 85 group of friends are countries, and there's also partners. The European Union is a partner on it. And they want to have the implementation machinery in place by 2010, and they're working frantically on it. And they'll probably be trying this until the end of time. And is there a battle out there between good and evil? You bet. You bet. And where they're headed with this thing, most seriously, is something called earth worship. And a lot of the environmental movement is pointed that way. Suddenly we have to praise, sing hymns to, and protect the earth. And our loyalty we have to thank the earth, who has been transformed into a goddess called Gaia, Gaia. And that is one of the pillars, an earth charter, and that is one of the pillars of their New World religion. It's a line we dare not cross. There is a strict scriptural warning: fear God and give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment is come. Worship God who created the heaven, the earth, the sea, and the fountains of waters. The New World religion they would foist upon you, the one they would have your children singing hymns to in school, is you worship the heaven, you worship the earth, you worship the universe, you thank the universe. Remember those cosmic energies that come from the universe? You worship yourself, you worship everybody but the good Lord who created it. It's a strong dividing line, and it was a line for which there was an eternal penalty, that if anybody worshiped the beast and their image, they would suffer the everlasting wrath of God. And for me and my house, as Joshua said when he was addressing the Israelites, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Thank you very much. God bless.